replace the income tax, you would have to raise tariffs across the board 70% to make up for the loss of the income tax, which would, I think, create huge economic problems. I respect your impartiality and your neutrality, but the numbers don't seem to add up to anything that would help the country. Let me switch to something else that might be more within your line of response. You said in your opening statement that labor markets appear to be in a better balance. And that's one of the key factors to judge whether interest rates can be raised. I must say I'm concerned a bit that we're not on a very faster track to decreasing interest rates from the Fed, and because of the better balance you cite. Could you comment on that, Mr. Chairman?
Sure. So the most recent labor market data do send, to your point, a pretty clear signal that labor market conditions have cooled considerably compared to where they were 2 years ago. This is no longer an overheated economy. This is an economy, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is more or less back by most measures to where it was before the pandemic. And that was a strong labor market, but it was not an overheated labor market. So I think the upshot of that really is that we're well aware that we now face two-sided risks and have for some time. But now, the labor market appears to be fully back in balance. We know that if we move too quickly, we risk unnecessarily hampering economic activity and possibly interfering with the ongoing expansion. We know that if we move too slowly, that we may undo the good we've done. Well, actually, it's the other way. If we loosen policy too late or too little, we could hurt economic activity. If we loosen policy too much or too soon, then we could undermine the progress on inflation. So we're very much balancing those two risks, and that's really the essence of what we're thinking about these days.
But the direction seems to be going towards lowering interest rates at some point. We would hope that might be a wish rather than a direction.
But I think if you look at the last summary of economic projections, I guess I would say it this way: it doesn't seem likely that the next policy move would be a rate increase. We don't take things like that off the table, but that does not seem the likely direction. The likely direction does seem to be as we make more progress in inflation and as the labor market remains strong, we begin to loosen policy at the right moment.
Thank you. Just 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court handed down 2 decisions that impact every federal regulatory agency, including the Federal Reserve. They overturned the Chevron case, which had eliminated judicial deference to agency decision-making for many, many decades. And they also dramatically extended the statute of limitations under the Administrative Procedure Act. What is your judgment is the cumulative effect of these decisions on the Federal Reserve? More broadly, what does it mean to the economy if virtually any regulatory decision the Fed makes can be second-guessed by a judge? What position are we in now?
So we're as an institution very focused on reading the actual letter and intent of the law and following it carefully. This is a strong institutional value that we have. Those are brand new decisions that just came down, and we're really in the process of just studying them. I don't have anything for you on them, but we will, of course, follow the law as the Supreme Court has read it, because that's their job.
Well, thank you, and I concur with compliance with the law. But when you do your analysis, and if it is detrimental to your ability to regulate the banking industry in the United States, I think you have an obligation to make that public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, we've heard a steady stream of commentary that there will be changes to Basel III endgame proposal. That can be seen certainly as good news. Some reports say it could be finalized as soon as August.
South Carolina.
Others say you are circulating a term sheet for a revised proposal. Through it all, this proposal will have outsized impacts on our banking system, from big to regional to our U.S.-based foreign institutions, as well as impeding access to credit for consumers. So even though you yourself have said there will be broad and material changes, I believe this proposal is flawed, both in process and in substance, and should be withdrawn. Do you agree, and will you commit to withdrawing the existing proposal and issuing a new proposal with a robust notice and comment process?
Let me update everyone on the status of all that. So over the past several months, we've had, in fact, Vice Chair for Supervision Barr has held a series of discussions with the other bank regulatory agencies around potential changes to the original proposal. I'm pleased to say that we've made quite a bit of progress on those and are very close to agreeing on the substance of those changes. And I can't really be specific because nothing is agreed until everything's agreed, so I won't have a lot of specifics for you today. The question where we're continuing to try to make progress is that of process. So it is my view, it is the strongly held view of members of the board that we do need to put a revised proposal out for comment for some period. And the reason is, when there are broad and material changes, that has been our practice. We don't see a reason to deviate from that practice. It seems to be consistent with past practice and with the Administrative Procedure Act. So that's very much what we think. And we're working through that question with the FDIC and the OCC. We haven't reached agreement on that, but I'm very hopeful that we will. We're prepared to move forward when we do reach agreement on that.
Well, I appreciate most of your response there. I do want to discuss one aspect more of Basel before we move on to another topic. I find it very concerning with how much of this proposal, this process appears to have been done behind closed doors. The Fed, the FDIC, OCC proposed the Basel III endgame last July. Then in October, the Fed began the collection of data to conduct a quantitative impact study on the cost of Basel III proposal, a study which I will note should have been conducted before any proposal was ever issued. Move forward to January of this year, Vice Chair Barr committed to a public comment period once results of the study were published. We are still waiting to view the results. Keep in mind, all the while, we're hearing rumors that the Fed is working on revising its proposal and moving towards an updated version. Please help me understand, how will the Fed revise or reissue a capital proposal before receiving public comments? Basically my question.
Well, as you know, we have received extensive public comments, and we've also evaluated the quantitative impact survey that you mentioned.
Yes.
And so the idea would be when we do reach agreement with the other agencies fully, that we would publish the proposed changes and also the quantitative impact survey, and also the effects that the QIS suggests that the changes would have. So we'll put all that out for comment again for a period of time, and then having had yet another round of comment, and we can then move toward finalizing. That's basically the broad strokes of how I would see this moving forward.
And how long do you see that opportunity for public comments?
So it would be meaningful. I mean, it might be 60 days. We don't need to it doesn't need to be a long one. But, before we do that, there's a lot of work that needs to take place, before you actually put out the revised proposal. Quite a bit of work. So it will take some time, and then we would put it out, and then there would be, I'm just taking that number, 60 days of comment, and then we would get the comments back, and there would be another period of evaluating the comments, and only then would you go final. So there are a number of steps here.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just final point as I'm running out of time here. I think Senator Reid made the comment about the Chevron case and the impact that it could have, certainly curtailing, from my perspective, the regulatory state. The necessity of a cost-benefit analysis on new regulations that will impact the economy, I think, is quite helpful. In the 1,000+ pages of Basel III, I think there were about 20 pages that reflected some kind of cost-benefit analysis approach. I really hope that we see more of that going forward.
Thank you.
Senator Tester from Montana is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the courtesy. Chairman Powell, good to see you here today.
You're listening to the Senate Banking Committee and Fed Chair Jay Powell. Jay Powell now being questioned by John Tester. He is a senator, Democrat, joining him now.
Whether it's Billings or Butte or Bozeman or Busby or Big Sandy, it doesn't matter. Larger towns to medium-sized towns to small towns, housing is a huge issue. And I think it's a huge issue all over the country, and correct me if I'm not correct in that. And I was wondering how the housing challenges fit into the overall economic picture that you're seeing.
So we do pay a lot of attention, and I would agree with you. We have significant housing issues in the country, and we had them before the pandemic. Certainly, the pandemic has created new distortions, and you know, monetary policy works through interest-sensitive spending. There is no more interest-sensitive spending than, you know, buying a house and having a mortgage. So, for sure, our tighter policy is having an effect on economic activity in the housing sector. But I would also say the best thing we can do for housing is to succeed in getting inflation down to 2% on a sustainable basis so that rates can come down so that the housing market can get back to what was the pre-pandemic normal, which is to say still a housing shortage, but not dealing with the kinds of specific things we're dealing with now.
So let me drill down a little bit. I'm speaking not necessarily from a housing cost interest, and you're correct on the things you just brought up. I'm speaking more from a standpoint of economic growth, in that there are plenty of small businesses, schools, hospitals, Main Street businesses that can't hire people, they can't expand because there simply is no place for them to live. How does that fit into your economic outlook metrics? Because I think it's, from my perspective at least, I think it's limiting the opportunity for expansion. It's limiting the opportunity for entrepreneurs, business startups. And does that fit into the economic picture that you look at?
So our mandate is for stable prices and maximum employment. And again, I think for housing supply, the best thing we can do is get inflation under control so that rates can come back down, so that we can have a more normalized set of rates and a more normalized housing system. But I think policies to increase housing supply are really not so much in the hands of the Fed, they're in the hands of legislatures, you know, state and federal.
Do you believe that if we were to put forth some housing incentives, whatever they may be, that could have if those incentives resulted in more affordable workforce housing on the market, that would have positive impacts on the economy?
You know, these are questions for you, but I would say this, that I'm aware that housing is in short supply, and that for many it's a critical need for the workforce. Okay. And so more of it is better. But as to where the fiscal policy how you should prioritize that, that's not up to us.
Look, I want to talk about the independence of the Fed for a second, because I know that you are a strong supporter of independence, as am I, and political influence, I don't think, helps with monetary policy in the country. And so give me your perspective, at least, on why the central bank independence is so critically important.
Thank you. I'd be glad to. So essentially all advanced economies have adopted a policy of central bank and operational independence. And that just means that we make our decisions, we're instructed to make them without taking in extraneous factors, one of which would be politics. And the record is pretty clear that that's a good it's a good institutional arrangement that serves the public well. And, you know, we just want to stress, as we do periodically, that this is an institutional choice that we make as a country, and that as long as it's seen to serve the public well, it's a good choice. We think so.
Okay, on advanced economies, there's some that talk about the economy of this country not being in very good shape. From your perspective, tell me how the economy of this country is doing compared to other advanced economies that have central banks.
You know, so I'm in lots and lots of international discussions as part of my job, and the story for the last 2 years has been just how exceptional the performance of the U.S. economy has been, and that's not a secret. You know, clearly the U.S. economy has performed very well compared to sort of our advanced economy colleagues.
Is there any country in the world with a central bank, any advanced economy that's performing better?
Better as a central bank?
Any economy that's an advanced economy that has a central bank that performs better than us?
None comes to mind. As I think of the majors, the answer would be no.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Rounds of South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
All right,
Chairman.
we're listening to Fed Chairman Jay Powell speaking in front of the Senate Banking Committee. Questioning now is Mike Rounds, Republican of South Dakota.
Items, and I'm going to start with the Basel III endgame discussion. I think Senator Scott did an excellent job of kind of laying out the concerns that many of us have had with it. I would like to go back into just one particular issue, which I think a lot of folks out there that follow this, and I know it's technical in nature, but let me just ask a specific question and you can kind of pick it apart for me, please. Both you and Vice Chair Barr have confirmed that there will be material changes to every risk type outlined in the proposal. Since there will be significant changes, do you believe where the agencies have landed now would be considered a logical outgrowth of the original proposal from last summer?
For those people who are not familiar with, that's the legal test for that turns out to be if it's a logical outgrowth. If it's not a logical outgrowth, that would legally require a reproposal. And I don't want to make the legal judgment. I will just say again, from my standpoint, my view and strongly held view of some of my colleagues on the board is that it will be appropriate for us to put out the changes again for a period of comment, just because it's the right thing to do. It's what we would do typically in a situation where there are, material changes to a proposal.
Do you feel that you have a consensus in the board to allow that to move forward in terms of an additional comment period?
Yes, but of course we have to get the FDIC and the OCC. We're in discussions with them to work on something that would meet that need, and we have to get there.
The only reason why I push is because there are so many folks directly involved with this and the impact on our economy here and with a lot of our financial institutions. This is a significant change, and it's one that a lot of people are following. So I'm trying to get you to get into the depth of this as much as possible, and I thank you for that. I'd also want to go into one other area, and once again, this is something that you and I have had visits about in front of this group before, but I want to talk about what the parts of inflation are and what parts you can control and what parts, as the Fed, you really can't control. The demand side of the equation on inflation is the part that you have the tools to work with. But there is the supply side of the equation, which is still out there. And I want to just lay this out because as we do this in this setting, it naturally becomes political in nature because one of the starting points that we talk about is when this administration took office and what happens with supply side issues at that time. And as I work my way through this, I just want to share the concern that I've got. And then I recognize you don't want to be political in it, but I want to lay this out. And then I want to talk about what you can control and what you can't control with regard to making changes on inflation through the processes that you have. When President Biden took office, gasoline prices, since President Biden took office, gasoline prices have risen over 54%. Energy prices have risen 41%. Fuel oil prices have risen 37%. Now, I can go on, but you understand what I'm saying is that energy has increased substantially. And I think one of the reasons for this has been additional demand as we've come out of a pandemic, but the challenges that we've seen in this country.
That's a question that we've thought about a lot, and any attempt to reduce that to a precise number would be inappropriate because it's so uncertain. But I think we can say, I believe strongly, there's a significant demand element and there's a significant supply element, and we've seen the supply side heal so much over the course of the last year or so, and we clearly see that that's contributing to lower inflation. We also see cooling demand, for example, in the labor market. So the two forces are working together. I can't really break it down. It would be such an imprecise estimate.
Just simply an acknowledgement, though, that it is both demand.
It's both. It's definitely
and
both.
It is supply.
It is both. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
Chair Powell, unemployment has risen by 0.5 percentage point over the past year. The number of job openings has dropped almost 50%. The hiring and quit rates are now below pre-pandemic levels.
You're listening to Fed Chair Jay Powell, Speaker of the Senate Banking Committee. Currently speaking is Chairman Sherrod Brown, a Democrat from Ohio.
Progress we made on creating good-paying jobs. Full employment is part of the mandate, as you say over and over. How are you assessing the risks of higher interest rates in the labor market?
So I completely agree with your characterization. The latest data do show that we've had considerable cooling in the labor market. And we're very much aware that we have two-sided risks now, as I mentioned earlier, and we're determined to balance those as best we can. We want to see more good inflation data, and we also want to continue to see a strong labor market. And those two things are equal under the law. We have this challenging thing to balance.
Two, when the Fed began raising rates, has the volume of housing sales. Two, when the Fed began raising rates, has the volume of housing sales decreased.
I believe it has, yes.
Since late 2022, has the median home price increased?
I believe it has.
Since late 2022, have monthly mortgage payments become more affordable or less affordable for home buyers?
Less affordable.
Okay, thank you. In short, despite housing sales declining, the median price for a single family home has increased by nearly $20,000. People are spending a greater share of their income in mortgage payments. So in some higher rates, it's clear from your answers and data, it's clear higher rates are not bringing down housing costs. The cost of home ownership is only going up. Let me shift to the Synops bankruptcy. Since mid-May, tens of thousands of people, including many Ohioans, have lost access to their money due to the bankruptcy of this fintech middleman. Reports indicate that as much as $95 million may have gone missing. The Fed oversees one of Synops's former partner banks, Evolve Bank and Trust. As a regulator, it's your job to make sure that banks protect the people whom they serve. What's the Fed doing to help customers who felt the impact by the Synops collapse? What are you doing to regain access to their money?
So we do supervise the bank. We don't supervise Synapse, or let alone the fintechs that feed into Synapse. And we're strongly encouraging Evolve to do whatever it can to help make money available to those depositors. We also, as you may know, did an enforcement action.
Of when those bank CEOs testified in front of this committee, the report, the incentive-based compensation that led to the bank's failure, I mentioned, it said that SVB managers, quote, had a financial incentive to focus on short-term profit over sound risk management. That's what a number of us, Senator Smith, Senator Butler, Senator Warner and I have said over and over, that short-term profit over sound risk management causes significant problems to our financial system. Compensation practices still pose a threat to our banking system. I urge you to move quickly to join your colleagues in the long overdue rulemaking on executive compensation. I mean, you read the reports at the outrage of the public about executive compensation continuing to go up and up and up and up. You have a role, a significant role, a legal role to deal with that. Thank you. Senator Tillis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
All right, right now we're listening to testimony. Fed Chairman Jay Powell addresses the Senate Banking Committee. Right now we're hearing questions from Tom Tillis, Republican from North Carolina.
Commitment from you on releasing the results of the QIS.
Yeah, we plan to release the results of the QIS.
What time frame?
Well, first we have to get agreement with the other banking agencies, but as soon as possible.
Can you imagine any agencies having a concern with any other banking agencies having a concern with releasing it, or is it just a matter of pro forma? Okay.
It's just a matter of the bigger picture of getting agreement on the revisions to Basel III and also how to proceed.
That's great, and I really appreciate the. So it sounds like we're taking some suggestions from some of my colleagues. Or plays from a playbook that didn't prove to be very effective back in the 70s. What can we learn? I'm not going to ask you about where you go from here, but if we look back into a postmortem on some of the decisions that were made when we had consistently high inflation, we had consistently high unemployment. What lessons can we learn there, or what mistakes should we not necessarily repeat? And I know that this is a fingerprint of a challenge. It's not exactly like the stressors that we had back in the 70s, but what can we learn from the decisions, what I think are arguably the wrong decisions made back then when we were dealing with high unemployment and high inflation? What did we learn?
I think the number one thing we learned was that it's up to the central bank to take it on and stick with it until it's done. And that doesn't sound controversial now, but it actually was back then. And so people didn't really get in there and get it done, and inflation kept coming back. I also think there are significant differences this time to the questions a minute ago. This is a combination of a supply side that we had very significant supply shocks, along with big demand shocks from the reopening of the economy and from all the other things that happened. So I think we have to, each one of these things is different in its own way. We try to learn the lessons of history, though.
You agree or disagree? Any disconnect between inflation and inflation expectations from the 2% target should be to ensure the banks are not unduly influenced? If the current proposal, for example, the outsized operational risk costs were high, are we going to take care of that in any sort of reproposal?
Let me just say we're very conscious of the comments across the spectrum: foreign banks, domestic banks, small, medium-sized banks. Everyone's going to get heard carefully as part of this process. That is our obligation.
And I think in response to Senator Round's question, you did indicate that probably because of the nature of the likely changes from what Mr. Barr expected to what may ultimately come, we are going to open it up to comment again.
That's the strong view of the Federal Reserve. We're working on that question with the FDIC and the OCC to try to find a path to do that. But
Very good.
From our standpoint, that's essential.
I think it's a strong view from at least several members on this side of the dais here. That would be very, very important, because I think it's going to materially change. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Tillis. Senator Warner of Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, it's good to see you again.
You're listening to the Senate Banking Committee testimony of Fed Chair Jay Powell, now being questioned by Senator Democrat Mark Warner of Virginia.
Otherwise already hit, because I make sure it's noted that I raised them as well. First of all, I want to agree with the chairman. I probably hear more on housing and housing affordability than any other issue, and I agree with the chairman. I know we've discussed this around a rate cut, and I understand most of your answer, but I still want to add my 2 cents here. We've got to find a way to start bringing mortgage rates down and let people get unlock that housing market. And again, we've discussed the rate cut issue, and I know you've got to navigate that, but HOPEX with existing regulatory structure in terms of market risk, credit risk, with existing regulatory structure in terms of market risk, credit risk. And I, again, hope that we will have that as the revisions come out. I think one of the things that this debate around Basel III raised was that it is, my understanding at least, looked at, you may be all looking at revisions to liquidity standards as well, and wanted to see what you could say about that and whether that part of those standards are under review and what your thinking is.
Yeah, and I think that actually connects to the Silicon Valley Bank questions as well, where I think there seems to be a need to update assumptions about liquidity. And that's a separate proposal that we're also working on. And, very important. I think we saw how fast that run was. It was just exponentially faster than prior runs. That's the new world. And that's some estimate of what that world is baked into things like the liquidity coverage ratio, for example.
Right, and wasn't that the case, if you had 25 cents on every depository dollar leave in 6 hours, no matter what the capital standards are.
Yeah.
And one of the things, I guess, there was a lot of talk after SVB that we need to think about internet-driven runs. A lot of us raised concerns. Candidly, I'm not sure I've heard any good proposals. So whether it comes from you guys or from folks listening, how we think about this new internet-driven world, and frankly, I think some of the irresponsible behavior by some of the folks that were major depositors.
Who's Vice Chair for Supervision, is leading a process of looking at the way we supervise banks and thinking about how we can be faster where it's appropriate, more forceful where it's appropriate. And I think, they've taken a pretty deep dive and tried to learn these lessons and then implement them in a way that is appropriate. So that's a big project going on at the Fed right now, which really Vice Chair for Supervision leads.
I think I remember lots of conversations with the chairman, with you, with the FDIC, and that Thursday through Sunday. And I think the solution you guys came up with, the administration came up with by Sunday night, was a good one. But they were a pretty scary 3 or 4 days there. And it did seem like the process, I don't know completely how you get fully ahead of that. But I firmly believe that there should have been a clearer early warning system and trying to make sure that we wouldn't be in that kind of crisis situation going forward. And again, I would strongly encourage any additional thoughts on this technology risk and how we get that right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next in order, Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
All right, we're listening to Fed Chairman Jay Powell as he addresses the Senate Banking Committee. Speaking right now is Senator John Kennedy,
Chairman,
Republican from Louisiana.
Our economy is slowing, is it not?
Yes, although still growing at a solid pace.
Our unemployment rate is rising, is it not?
Yes, it is, although the labor market is still strong.
Our labor market is slowing, is it not?
They've been, as it was this time, they've been the predominant creators of jobs. That tells you that job creation is becoming less broad in the economy and it's narrowing.
It tells you that government's creating those jobs, doesn't it?
Well, it's government. It's also in-person services. It's also some of it's government.
Manufacturing's been flat.
Yes, manufacturing's not creating a lot of new jobs these days.
Information technology shed jobs over the past 2 years, hasn't it?
I don't know.
Leisure and hospitality jobs have slowed to almost a trickle.
So that's a place where there was a desperate worker shortage, and they've done quite a bit of hiring, but they're catching up now.
I mean, three quarters of the jobs that are being created in our economy can be related directly or indirectly to our spending deficits, can't they?
In this report, in this single report, I don't know that healthcare is really government spending. I mean, that's something people are consuming.
Where do you think these hospitals get their money?
They may get it, but I mean, people are not. The spending on healthcare is not necessarily directly related to deficits. Is my point.
I would disagree with you. I mean, here's my point. We talk a lot about expectations in terms of inflation. How if we expect there to be inflation, we'll get inflation. It seems
I wouldn't touch
you don't want to answer that
a sentence with that word in it.
Yeah. I mean, we can pretty this up all I guess my point is, and I know you're going to do this anyway, but I'd be really careful with this economy. I mean, people just don't feel better off today. And one can marshal a persuasive argument that, well, you should, compared to Europe or compared to China, compared to Canada. But feelings are feelings. People don't feel good about this economy. And it's primarily because of inflation. Let me use my final 30 seconds to ask you. I listened to my good friend, the chairman, give his opening statement. Do you think inflation was caused by corporate greed?
I hate to comment on something the chairman was speaking about.
Go ahead.
Well, so I will just say, we see at the Fed, we see inflation as when there's an imbalance between supply and demand. And we use our tools to work on the demand side of that and bring it back into line with supply.
I got 2 seconds. So when are you going to lower interest rates?
I'm today not going to be sending any signals about the timing of any future action.
Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Chair Powell. It's good to see you again. I want to follow up on.
We've been listening to Fed Chair Jay Powell, the Senate Banking Committee.
Very focused on this question. They really it comes up in all of our discussions. Europe has seen productivity increases of about 1% a year for 40 years. We've seen 2%. If you take a number and compound it at 1%, then compound it at 2%, the difference is just enormous after 40 years in terms of incomes and living standards. And their question is, why is that? Why is that? And the standard answer that Americans tend to give and that I would give is it's down to, more flexible labor markets. They, in the pandemic, they stayed in their existing jobs. In the United States, we had people changing jobs at record levels And, that's the kind of thing that adds to productivity and contributes to rising living standards, going back to school, getting skills and things like that. Another one is our financial sector. We don't just have banks, we have a highly developed ecosystem of financing sources that will fund early stage investments. Banks are really not set up to do that. They're prudentially regulated. And so those are some of the things. And I think we just have these natural strengths as an innovative, more flexible economy. We can grow faster.
I appreciate that. I think sometimes there's a tendency to sort of trash our economy and to sort of say, oh, we suck. And actually, I think that there's great resilience in our economy. I would argue that it has also to do a lot with the incredible resilience of our workers and their creativity and their talent and the training and the education that they have. And I think I would also argue, though I wouldn't expect you to make this case, that the way in which our federal government responds may fall disproportionately on smaller banks. I think that commercial and regional banks hold an estimated 2/3 of all the commercial real estate loans in the country. And so unlike larger banks, these smaller institutions might find it a little harder to deal with this. So could you discuss this with us? Could you tell us a little bit about how you see this risk and particularly whether this poses some additional risk that we might be seeing more concentration in the banking sector as these smaller banks are maybe under more pressure?
Yes, so this, to your point, this is a risk that has been with us and will be with us for some time, probably for years. And banks need to be, honestly assessing what their risk is. They need to be assured that they have the capital and the liquidity and the systems in place to manage this risk. The stress test that we apply to the largest institutions stressed commercial real estate pretty hard. And again, the conclusion is that the large banks can manage this problem. And most small banks can too, but it is in some smaller banks that tend to have that local concentration in commercial real estate. And, we're in touch with those banks. The supervisors and regulators are in touch with those banks and making sure that they can manage them. And it's going to be an issue for many banks, but it's one that we're trying to work through, one that we're very much aware of. And again, it'll be with us for some time.
Thank you. I think so much about the importance of these small regional community banks in small towns, even big towns in Minnesota, and how important it is that, in my book, that they can stay independent and better serve their communities in that way. So I worry about this risk. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Had that conversation before, and no surprises today. I'm going to stick to those three topics, somewhat related to questions that you've been asked before relative to the housing market, housing affordability, and interest rates. I want to narrow the scope just a little bit to ask about those issues and challenges impact, again, the quality of life for America's next generation. Given the severe shortage of affordable and available homes to buy, coupled with high interest rates, young Americans are continually unable to afford homes and are pushed into a rental market, driving rental costs up. So there is sort of trickle-down impact here. A recent Washington Post analysis showed that Gen Z is spending 31% more on housing than their millennial counterparts were 10 years ago after adjusting for inflation. How do you view, that was a long lead-in to just ask the question, how do you envision or view the interest rates of today and the monetary balancing, policy balancing that the Fed is doing on contributing to the future generation predicament if we are to extrapolate the conditions of today?
So our job, of course, is the whole economy and inflation for the whole economy. And the absolute best thing we can do for younger people is to restore price stability so that as we benefited from, I graduated from college in 1975, near the end of the big inflation period. So during most of my...
The impact of the hurricane, I wanted to pull in your sort of thoughts about the Fed pilot on the climate scenario exercise. In May, the Fed conducted a pilot climate scenario exercise and asked the 6 largest U.S. banks to examine their balance sheets and how it would be effective if a large hurricane hit the Northeast. They reported facing data gaps on property characteristics, their counterparties and insurance coverage. how does the Federal Reserve intend to invest in expanding modeling resources for banks that are implementing climate-related financial disclosures?
So we haven't made any decisions on what to do with that information or whether to repeat that exercise. To your point, it was really a learning exercise. You know, how are banks thinking about this, and how are they modeling it, and how does it work really? It's a very, very challenging thing to model. And so that was really the nature of this exercise. In terms of disclosures, you know, we don't really have that's not really our job. That's really the SEC. So, but you know, we don't have a big job on climate, but what it really is to make sure that the institutions we regulate are aware of and understand the risks that they run, including risks from climate.
And that they're prepared, and learning how to as would be the point over time. So what criteria will you use to evaluate whether or not you would run the exercise again and or share more broadly the results of that?
Lowering rates. Can you give us any color as to what it is you're looking for in the data and how long it might take us to get there?
We need just to see more good inflation data. That's all. We had 7 months of good inflation data at the end of last year. Then we had a quarter, really a month or so, where inflation went up, and now we had one really good inflation reading and one pretty good one. We just need to see more so that confidence rises. I'm not going to tell.
Are we weeks away, months away?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to avoid sending any really specific signals about time today because it's going to depend on the data. It also matters what's going on in the labor market, though. You know, we've also said that if the labor market weakens unexpectedly, that could be a case for loosening policy as well. Really, we're weighing both those factors.
Here's one of my concerns. I'm sure you probably share it, but we're coming off of a 40-year high in inflation. We've seen the rate of inflation coming down, but we haven't gotten to the 2% target. And my concern, for lack of a better term, is whether or not this might be transitory in terms of the data that we're seeing right now.
That's exactly why we're approaching this question carefully.
I thought that might be your answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we shift now to the issuance of Treasury debt? The Fed is the largest holder of Treasury debt. In February, you and I talked about the pressures that our fiscal deficit is exerting on interest rates, which by extension makes your job more difficult. I'd like to talk this time about how Treasury issuance is impacting our economy and our monetary policy. First, just a basic question. If Treasury issuance were to shift drastically, either to the long end or the short end of the curve, would that affect interest rates or maybe more sense with your monetary policy goals of taming inflation?
So we take Treasury's debt management decisions. We don't comment on them. We just do our job.
No, I'm not asking for a comment on their decision, but just as a simple mathematical truth. If they're pulling down demand on the long end of the curve, doesn't that...
I wouldn't say that has important inflation implications, no.
You know, it just feels to me the same way that the Biden administration drains the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that undermines our ability to respond to energy shocks. When the Treasury manages its debt in this manner, it constrains our ability to respond to future economic shocks. And that opens our nation up to very real risk, whether it be amplifying the effects of the Fed's balance sheet reduction, flooding the supply of one of the most important short-term debt instruments. The risks seem to me to be mounting for Treasury market disruption. I'd like to know what your thoughts are, Mr. Chairman, about how the Fed will navigate this and whether you've had discussions with the Treasury about this growing dangerous dynamic.
No, we don't have a seat at the table on Treasury debt management. Treasury makes those decisions, and they don't have a seat at our table on monetary policy.
I just think the risk is very obvious here, though, where we're headed with this type of portfolio.
Honestly, it's completely out of bounds for me to comment on Treasury debt management in any way.
I think you've been dealt a very difficult hand here, Mr. Chair. The Biden administration's policies aimed at gin up the economy ahead of the election. These efforts directly undermine your policy goals at the Fed. That includes excessive issuance of short-term debt. Think about it, Freddie Mac's backstop of second mortgages, unlawful student debt loan cancellations, the draining of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to suppress fuel prices, and President Biden's own jawboning of the FOMC to lower rates. As you know,
though, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act. Section 956 told financial regulators solve this problem. 2 months ago, regulators put forward a proposal, but the Fed refused to join. Now, in 2018, you told this committee, Mr. Chairman, that you, quote, expect that banks will have in place compensation plans that do not provide incentives for excessive risk-taking. In other words, you trusted the banks to write their own rules. So let's see if they actually have. One thing the proposal would do is require big banks to delay bonuses for a broad group of critical employees who are able to gamble with the bank's finances, like the head of a trading desk, for example. Chair Powell, in the 6.5 years since you said trust the banks to regulate themselves, how many of the 10 biggest banks have put policies in place to delay annual bonuses for this broader group of critical employees whose risk-taking could endanger the bank?
I don't know specifically. My guess is all of them. Since the financial crisis.
You're the regulator who said trust the banks to self-regulate so we can avoid another financial meltdown or another bailout. And you don't know if they did or didn't do that?
Well, it's a very, very specific, narrow question you're asking about.
Because it's something a regulator should do. You think the answer is 10 out of 10? The answer is 0.
To regulate themselves?
When you say, I expect that the banks will have in place compensation plans that do not provide incentives for excessive risk-taking.
Right, pursuant to the guidance that we issued in 2010, which is quite detailed.
And you have not issued a guidance since you made these comments, since you became chair. And how many banks have actually put in place the regulations that you said, I expect the banks will have in place? The answer is out of 10,
it was covered
0.
by the 2010 guidance.
No,
actually.
you said in 2018 that they would put these in place.
They said they would have in place.
No, that is not what you said. So look, Chair Powell, the last guidance on this subject, as you say, was in 2010, which is before you were at the Fed. The Fed has now refused to join the other financial regulators in finalizing a rule implementing Section 956 as Congress directed. So my question has been, how many of the 10 biggest banks have done this? And the answer is 0. Dodd-Frank was passed 14 years ago. There are still no rules to stop banks from rewarding executives' risky behavior. When you were asked about these Section 956 rules or lack of rules in March of this year, you said, quote, that you wanted to understand the problem we're solving before proposing a rule. Chair Powell, the law does not say Jerome Powell in his infinite...
Thanks, Chair Powell, for being here. I appreciate you coming by our office last week to discuss some of these... thanks, Chair Powell, for being here. I appreciate you coming by our office last week to discuss some of these issues. I would ask something I imagine most of my colleagues are not asking, which is the relationship between...
You've been listening to Fed Chair Jay Powell testifying in front of the Senate Banking Committee, currently asking questions. Senator J.D. Vance, Republican from Ohio.
And I recognize this is not your policy focus, but you are the Federal Reserve Chairman, so I just want to get your views on this. And in particular, I want to read you a quote from Mickey Bowman, who's one of your governors. And this says, in a quote, there's a risk that increased immigration and continued labor market tightness could lead to persistently high core services inflation. Given the current low inventory of affordable housing, the inflow of new immigrants in some geographic areas could result in upward pressure on rents as additional housing supply may take time to materialize. With labor markets remaining tight, wage growth has been elevated at around or above 4%, still higher than the pace consistent with our 2% inflation goal, given trend productivity growth. The Bank of England, I believe, produced a recent report on this issue in the United Kingdom, obviously a different economy in a different country. But what do you see as the relationship, in particular, given that housing is such a big driver of the inflation that we've seen over the last few years? As Senator Haggerty said, the highest in 40 years. What role do you see illegal immigration playing in driving up housing costs, which, of course, is a main driver of inflation for American citizens?
Let me quickly start by echoing your first comment, which is we don't comment on immigration policy, but we do comment on inflation. So the other.
So I want to follow up on that thread, but just on that topic of particular areas that have been affected. Chairman Brown, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter for the record from the city of Springfield in our state, the southwestern part of our state, which I think highlights a very real example of this particular concern, straight from the horse's mouth itself. Now, this letter, I want to quote from it. Springfield has seen a surge in population through immigration that has significantly impacted our ability as a community to produce enough housing opportunities for all. Springfield's Haitian population has increased 15 to 20,000 over the last 4 years in a community of under 60,000 previous residents, putting a significant strain on our resources and ability to provide ample housing for all of our residents. And end quote there. And Mike.
Without objection, so.
Thank you. In my conversations with folks in Springfield, it's not just housing. They're trying to build 5,000 new housing units, which is a very Herculean task in a town of about 55,000 people. But it's also hospital services, it's school services, there are a whole host of ways in which this immigration problem, I think, is having very real human consequences. But if we go back to just one other question, Chair Powell, on this immigration and labor supply question. So one of the euphemistic ways in which economists, I think, sometimes talk about labor supply and immigration is they'll say something to the effect of, well, an increase in labor supply has put downward pressure on labor prices. And what they're effectively saying is that increased immigration has put downward pressure on the wages of American workers. I wonder, when you hear sort of your colleagues and
a couple of years in a context of an extremely tight labor market, now a little bit less tight, significantly less tight, but you've got a worker shortage, you've got businesses who have jobs that are open, you have, more than one job opening for every unemployed person. So you've got a very tight labor market, and it's addressing that, and we're having wage increases are still very high, but they're coming down to a more sustainable level.
Fair. And Mr. Chair, I know I'm over time, could I just one more question on this? Thank you. I understand your point, Chair Powell, and again, I'm not ascribing value judgments to you, but if we say we have a really tight labor market, and we say that there are more than one job openings per worker, there are two ways you could plausibly solve that, probably more than that, but two obvious ways you could plausibly solve that. One is through a new influx of workers via the immigration system. Another way is by raising wages and bringing some of the workers that are on the sidelines. I think specifically of the 7 million prime age men that have dropped out of the labor force. Like, why isn't that more the focus of policymakers rather than, you see a labor shortage, rather than bringing in a large number of new immigrants, why not try to boost wages in a way that brings some of those workers off the sidelines? That seems to be a much better focus from my perspective.
Certainly, that's a very constructive focus. I would agree. It's not, I don't think it has to be one or the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen from Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're listening to testimony Fed Chairman Jay Powell as he addresses the Senate Banking Committee. Speaking right now with questions is Chris Van Hollen, Democrat from Maryland.
So far, being on track to bring down inflation without, so far, trigger the engine of the economy. The labor market is cooling faster than previously known. The unemployment rate is above 4% for the first time since 2021. It is taking workers longer to find jobs. Economic activity in the service sector, which is responsible for 2/3 of economic growth, slowed in June. So my question, Mr. Chairman, is how do you take all of these factors into account? Do you share my concern that as of today, there is a real risk of an increase in unemployment larger than is currently on your radar screen?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do, even more so than in March when we were here, see that. So we've seen, and I think the latest data show that labor market conditions have now cooled considerably from where they were 2 years ago. And I wouldn't have said that until the last couple of readings. And I would say also that for a long time, the risks were more that we would fail to hit our inflation target. I think the risks as to the two statutory targets we have, price stability and maximum employment, I think those are coming much more into balance. My colleagues and I are looking at that, and we fully understand that we have to manage this process of administering the federal funds rate and deciding what to do with it in a way that manages both of those risks. And the two mandates are equal under the law, and so yes, we do get that.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that you've seen that sort of, we are seeing the continuing drag created by high interest rates. So that has been I think all of our colleagues, as you probably heard today, are really hearing from our constituents, understandably, about the very high housing prices, and it's slowed investment in other sectors like manufacturing as well. In my final minute, I would like to turn to the question that Senator Warren asked, because I asked your colleague, Vice Chair Barr, about exactly this question of implementing Section 956 of Dodd-Frank when he was before the committee just a short time ago, May 16th of this year. And I asked him about why the Fed had not moved forward along with other agencies with respect to implementing what the law is and what the law has been for 10 years. NCUA has signaled their intent to propose a rule. The SEC has indicated that they're moving forward. I said to Vice Chair Barr that I've not seen any notice of proposed rule from the Fed, and can I get a commitment that the Fed will quickly begin the process implementing this law by issuing a notice of proposed rule? His answer was, and I'm quoting, "In discussions with my colleagues, it became apparent that at the board, we believe we need to conduct some further analysis before deciding what steps."
And after putting it out for comment, we looked at all these questions. It's been in place for 14 years. We supervise on it. And, so the question I'm asking is, okay, let's go ahead and look at what the practices are that are happening now, not that are happening before the global financial crisis when it was obvious that things needed to be changed. And we put the guidance in place. It seems to have largely worked, certainly as it relates to the large firms. And then let's design something that is designed to the residual risk, as opposed to just taking something off the shelf from 15 years ago and doing that. So and we're working on that at the Fed now. And again, the statute requires us to prescribe regulations or guidelines to prohibit those things. And I want to do that. In a sense,
so
we have done
just very briefly, and is it your testimony that the Fed has already met the requirements of site? Okay,
no,
just want to make that clear, and we do look forward to the Fed moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Brett from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, thank you for being with us today.
You're listening to the Senate Banking Committee, Fed Chair Jay Powell. Right now, you're seeing Senator Katie Britt, Republican from Alabama, questioning Jay Powell.
And her closing remarks, particularly about Dodd-Frank and 956. There was also a comment at the end where she mentioned you working for giant banks versus the American people. Now, I have a long list of questions I want to talk to you about, but I did want to get you to respond to that.
Yeah, that's completely untrue. The things that we're doing are consistent with our international obligations, and they're meant to be the best thing for the American access of what to do about them.
No, I appreciate that, because I do believe that currently it lacks a real cost-benefit analysis, and I think it really does need serious reconsideration. And additionally, when you take a look at it and its overlapping nature with Basel III, it seems inappropriate that we would move forward with a new long-term debt proposal, finalizing that rule, when we don't even really understand what Basel III is going to mean for capital requirements for banks and obviously financial institutions. So my question for you is just that. Would it be inappropriate to move forward with the long-term debt proposal, finalizing that rule prior to Basel III being finalized as well?
I don't know that I would I can't give you a clear answer on that. It will depend. I mean, Basel III won't be finalized for some time, but that's not to say we wouldn't reach a place where people understand and accept and support what it is that we're doing. And I think at that point, we could certainly move forward with other rules.
I heard you mention to one of my other colleagues that probably by the time this all took place, it would be the beginning of next year. I would just say my concern, the Fed has said that the long-term debt rule will directly be impacted by the final Basel product. And so, why would it be inappropriate or appropriate to move forward with that before banks can fully understand what they're facing from Basel? So I would just ask that y'all are thoughtful about that. These are a lot of things that people are dealing with and trying to really understand the implications of. And I think we have seen consistently that people are not skyrocketed and prices have ended up just getting passed down to the consumer. I mean, grocery prices are up 21% since January. So do you believe that the revised Basel proposal will alleviate these concerns that our farmers and our ag community have had about Basel III? And has the Fed done anything specifically to take a look at this? And if not, will you commit to doing so?
So I don't want to get into the specific changes that we're going to make. I'll just say that we're very well aware of and very focused on that particular set of changes and, paying close attention to the issues you've raised.
I appreciate that. And I also hope that the Fed when you craft these types of regulation, you really consider the relationship between the economic impact and the ability of community banks to serve their communities as well. I have heard you mention that to another one of my colleagues, so I know that you're committed to doing that, but that is incredibly important to Alabamians and our main streets all across the state. In my last few seconds, I want to touch on one more topic. So finding solutions to expanding affordable childcare is a top priority of mine, and it is something that I know a number of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle share an interest in and believe is an important issue as well. So Chair Powell, do you believe that increasing access to affordable childcare would positively impact labor participation in our country?
I do believe that.
Thank you.
Stowe of Nevada is recognized.
Thank you. Excuse me, Chairman Powell, thank you for joining us. And I always appreciate visiting with you in my office as well and your comments. Let me start by a comment you made in the opening. Over the past 2 years, you said
You've been listening to the Senate Banking Committee and
I certainly would.
Let me ask you this.
I certainly would.
Let me ask you this. Jumping around, and there's been talks today about the Fed's independence and how important the Fed's independence is. The Wall Street Journal recently reported former Trump administration officials drafted policy options to weaken the independence of the Federal Reserve if President Trump were to be elected in November. Allegedly, former administration officials discussed policy options to erode the Fed's independence to make it easier for a president to impact interest rate decisions or fire the Fed chair at will. Chairman Powell, how important is it that the Fed has independence to provide economic stability and anchor our inflation expectations?
So I think it's actually essential. It's literally essential. And the good news is I think that's pretty broadly understood, and particularly on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle. I believe that people do understand that we need to do our work in a way that's outside the political process to the maximum extent possible. Of course, we need to be accountable and tremendously transparent. If you look at the box in the Monetary Policy Report on central bank independence, it's really a box about transparency. That's the other side. So I think it's really important. I think it's an institutional arrangement that has served the public well. And, and I do believe that there's pretty wide support for it.
And you just said it has been intentional and institutional arrangement over the years for this very reason. Correct?
Yes, this is a choice that we make, and I think it's countries around the world, advanced economies.
And you look at the immigration issue.
So we don't, as you, just to make the point that you made, we don't take a position, we don't comment on immigration policy. We have no responsibility for it. It's not our job. But so we just look at the numbers and we sort of try to assess the economic consequences of immigration. And over the last 2 years, 2 years ago, we had an economy where we really had a labor shortage. And what's happened is we've had a wave of immigration, and many of those people have gone to work and gone to work legally through the asylum process. Not all of them. There's also a group that has not been legally processed, but many of this latest group have been have sought asylum and gone through the process of getting a work permit. So what that means is that employers wanted workers, and there were more job openings than there were people actively seeking work or working. And so now you have a new supply of workers, and they've filled those jobs. So we have a bigger economy, but it's not a tighter economy because labor supply has increased the economic capacity. That's just the arithmetic. That's not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. There are other policy choices that could be made, and they're not for us to make.
When you say greater economy,
A larger economy.
in other words, it has improved the growth of our economy.
The economy grew 3.4%, I believe, last year. And some part of that was that, as Congressional Budget Office analysis showed, and to many surprise, there had been a really significant uncounted group of workers coming into the country who had gone to work.
Beyond even the people who come here seeking beyond even the people who come here seeking asylum suddenly being available for the workforce, we have 1 million plus people who we welcome in legally every year, the vast majority of whom don't come in with a job or even a skill set. And we have so much work to do, colleagues, on the legal immigration front to create a connection between economic demands for workers and the skill set and education that our immigrants bring to us. So most every other country requires some sort of skill set useful in the economy. We don't do much of that. So that's just my speech for the moment. I know, Mr. Chairman, you've gotten already lots of very specific questions, and I've heard a couple of them on Basel III. So I'm just going to make an illustration, and you can comment on it if you'd like. But there's a large generation and transmission utility in North Dakota, rural electric cooperative, Basin Electric, very large G&T, members all over the upper Midwest. And they recently testified in front of the CFTC on Basel III, and they expressed a concern about how operations would be impacted if lending was curtailed or limited in any way. And they gave a real-world example, and I want to just give you that example. Now, remember, this is an electricity supply that we're talking about. It's critical it remains reliable. It's critical that it remains affordable. And part of an electric cooperative's risk management program, of course, is how it buys the fuel that generates the electricity and has some unique qualities about it. If you would like to comment on it, you've already stated that there are going to have to be changes. I just throw that into your box of things to think about, and you're welcome to comment if you'd like.
I'll just say we're well aware of that issue, and I appreciate you bringing it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, then, I'm just going to speak to this independence issue. I think that the senators that have questioned you on it are correct. I share that concern, as you know, that the independence of the Fed is essential. I have resisted moves within my own party to change it. But those moves are very narrow and not very, I don't think, very realistic. And I appreciate you pointing out that from what you can tell, at least on Capitol Hill, we're all pretty much united on that front. Perception does matter. It matters a great deal. And you and I have had discussions over the years on, you were very, you admonished us strongly as Congress to spend what we needed to spend to get through the pandemic and to maintain the economy. I think you were right to do that. You were just as aggressive in not responding to calls to rein it in a little bit when Democrats brought the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan to the forefront, and I think really basically hijacked the economy and put fuel on inflation. But perception matters, and so I would just submit to you, and you haven't said you're going to do this. I don't have any reason to believe you'll do this, but any move to lower interest rates or move interest rates either direction before November 5th could certainly be a bad perception, even if there's...
But many Georgians still feel the sting of unaffordable homes and mortgages, and one reason for this, you and I have discussed this, is that we aren't building enough houses. 2022 study published in the Journal of Economic Geography found that for every 10% increase in the housing stock, rents decreased by 1%. We've discussed this issue
particularly the effects of housing supply on housing costs. And we agreed that while the Federal Reserve does not control housing supply, it can help create the environment that encourages the construction of new housing, particularly affordable housing. Chair Powell, how has the Fed been working to foster an environment that encourages home construction, and what, in your view, are the challenges that remain?
So in the long run, the absolute best thing we can do for the housing market and for the economy is to sustainably bring inflation back down so that people aren't talking about it anymore. And it's just assumed by everybody in their daily lives that inflation will be around 2%, so we don't need to talk about it, which is where we were for a long time. We want to get back to that. Interest rates can come down then, and the housing market can return to the state it was in before the pandemic, which was to say really tight. We don't have enough housing, and that's not really a monetary policy issue. In the short term, though, I would say tight monetary policy weighs on the housing market. The
first-generation home buyers, and of course the conditions for them doing that improved to their favor with higher interest rates. Would you agree with that assessment?
I know some of that's happening. I don't know that higher interest rates make it. I mean, some of that's, they're working with.
Well, you got higher interest rates and you got institutional buyers who can purchase it all cash. Doesn't that further?
But they have to borrow the money at higher interest rates. I'm just saying higher interest rates doesn't make their investment any cheaper. And notwithstanding, I understand it's a sensitive issue, and in most markets, it's still a pretty small portion of the outstanding housing stock. But it's not an issue. It's not an issue for us. They're a legal buyer of housing. Our job is really the whole economy. I mean, it's more of a question for legislatures.
So how can the Fed better deploy its monetary tools to ensure that we are meeting key inflation objectives like housing affordability?
I think the best thing we can do is is kind of what we think we've been doing, which is to move carefully as we think about loosening policy and make sure that we do that when we've got greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably down toward 2%. We're also keeping a close eye on the labor market, and if we see unexpected weakening there, then we could respond to that too. But that's really the best thing we can do for the whole economy, and very specifically for the housing market too.
You well point out that you're limited influence there, and there is a role for Congress to be sure, which is one of the reasons I wanted to be on this committee to introduce a down payment toward Equity Act with my colleagues, and perspective has the Fed brought to this task force, brought to this task force, how are you responding to this issue of home appraisals?
So, as you know, we've been an active participant in that task force, and we bring all of the expertise we have in the housing market, as well as regulatory, supervisory, and economic expertise generally, as we look at that. And I'll also say that our strongly held view is that discrimination has no place in the banking system, and that includes appraisals and other valuations.
I agree with that, and quickly, I was glad to see that CFPB and other agencies recently finalized a rule that creates strong anti-discrimination standards for automated home evaluations. The Fed has not yet approved this rule. Why not, and does the Fed plan to do so?
Sorry, why do we?
You've not yet approved the rule that was made, that was suggested by the CFPB. They finalized the rule.
But do we? Sorry, I'm not aware that it's a rule that we have to finalize too. Is that the case?
That is my understanding.
Let me follow up with you on that. I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Daines of Montana is recognized.
Chairman, thank you. Chairman Powell, thanks for being here today. Certainly, it's
live coverage on Bloomberg Radio of Fed Chair Jay Powell's testimony before the Senate Banking Committee. Powell's answering questions right now from Steve Daines, Republican from Montana.
Waste no time attempting to sell a fairy tale to the American people, or mental gymnastics can make go away. Here's just a couple of examples. Breakfast cereal prices have increased 28% since January of 2020. Gas prices increased 36% from a national average of $2.63 a gallon to $3.58 per gallon. Egg prices have jumped $3 per dozen in 2024, double the cost of $1.45 in February of 2020. And this dishonesty doesn't stop with inflation. On the labor market, while President Biden and Senate Democrats are celebrating a victory lap in light of the recent jobs report showing a 206,000 new jobs last month, they're willfully ignoring the fact that more than a third of these job gains came from the government sector. Mr. Chairman, I commend you for the job you have done thus far in trying to rein in inflation. I encourage you to continue the fight despite the political pressures you may face. I'm also encouraged by the comments you made earlier this month about the dire need for Washington to address its fiscal imbalance. I couldn't agree more. I've said many times and continue to believe that Washington's culture of reckless spending, of excessive borrowing, is leading us down a very dangerous path by leaving future generations with mountains of debt. And I'm happy to hear you agree with that assessment. Mr. Chairman, given that it's an election year, you're undoubtedly facing immense political pressure to lower rates. Thus far, you've done an admirable job.
Bump in inflation in the first quarter, and now we've had one good and one bump in inflation in the first quarter, and now we've had one good and one very good inflation reading, and we need more good data so that we can be confident that what we're seeing is really, that's where inflation's going, that it's going back down toward 2%. We don't need to see it at 2%. Right now, we're at 2.6%. So that's on inflation. On the labor market, to your question, we've seen that the labor market has cooled really significantly across so many measures, and a number of people here today have pointed them out, and the unemployment rate has moved up. You see a labor market that is now pretty much in balance, pretty much where it was in 2019. It's not a source of broad inflationary pressures for the economy now, but it's still a strong labor market. 4.1% unemployment is a very good and historically low unemployment rate. So we have a mandate to support maximum employment, and we also are paying close attention. And if we see that the labor market were weakening unexpectedly, which is to say, more than what we've seen in a material way, unexpectedly, then we could also respond to that, because we have a dual mandate, and we now see the two mandates as more in balance than they were a year ago. Really, the focus had to be and was on inflation. Now we need to be focusing on both goals.
Chairman, thank you. I want to get one question on Basel III, and then we will. In March, this committee agreed that it was seriously flawed and needed to be completely rewritten. I was encouraged to see reports last month that the Federal Reserve had provided other financial regulations with possible change.
Proceed. That's how we would ordinarily proceed, and we don't see why we would deviate from that. And this is the conversation we're now having with the leadership of the FDIC and the OCC. And my hope is that we'll be able to come together around a way to proceed forward, very soon. I had hoped we would have done so by now, but I believe we will do so fairly soon.
Thank you for joining us today, Chair Powell. I look forward to working with you to strengthen this economy. For senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, they're due 1 week from today, July 16th. To Chair Powell, please submit your responses to questions for the record 45 days, no more than 45 days from the day you receive them. Thank you for your testimony. The committee's adjourned.
There you have it, live sound from Capitol Hill, live coverage on Bloomberg Radio. Day one, if you will, of 2 days of testimony in the Capitol. Fed Chair Jay Powell, in this case, before the Senate Banking Committee, with unfiltered Q&A here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. We welcome you. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. And of course, we're wrapping ourselves around this testimony today, simultaneous testimony on the House side today from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Asked when the Fed would cut, Fed Chair Jay Powell, quote, "I am not going to be sending any signals about the timing of any further actions." Not a big shock there as I look at the top live blog on the terminal covering the Fed Chair's testimony. He says more good inflation data would boost Fed confidence. That was from prepared remarks. We knew about that before the hearing, in fact, started. Labor market appears fully back in balance. He said that several times today, including just in that last Q&A with Senator Daines, and he stressed the needle or our better understanding of the Fed's plans for interest rates.
As you said at the top of the program, Chairman Powell said absolutely nothing directly speaking toward policy. If you read the tea leaves a little bit, at least to my ear, he came off as a little bit more dovish than some might have expected. He alluded to a dramatic cooling in the labor market about half a dozen times throughout his testimony today. And as he's mentioned before, and as we read in the FOMC minutes from the June meeting, if the balance of risk is essentially even, meaning there's a similar probability that the inflation rate rises further and that the unemployment rate rises further, and he's acknowledging considerable cooling in the labor market, if that's what's most front of mind for him, it seems to me as though he's feeling the itch to cut rates a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, if we care about the dual mandate, I, of course, have to ask you first about interest rates. When is he satisfied with the job market, or are we there, as he refers to it as being in balance?
Well, so as mentioned earlier, he does see the balance of risks essentially equal. He has mentioned multiple times, though, as well, that he views the policy stance as restrictive. So that's something that's been a question for a lot of folks who have been estimating a higher neutral rate for long-term interest rates, or a higher neutral long-term interest rate. So with the Fed feeling a little bit of pressure on the unemployment side, with the June payroll report showing that surprise uptick in the unemployment rate, closest change in monetary policy to a general election date since I think the establishment of the Fed. It's getting close in there, but the Fed is really trying to assert its political independence here. It is really trying to stay data dependent, and if the unemployment rate were to inch up just a bit more, say to 4.2% in the next two jobs reports, I think we can see that September cut.
Fascinating. Stuart, he's saying it out loud, everybody. I'm out of time here, Stuart, but do we get the same Jay Powell tomorrow on the other side?
The House is always a little bit messier. I think that we get the same Jay Powell, but I think that we get a little bit more political rhetoric from the folks on the dais.
We got a lot of commercials to make. It's campaign season, after all. Stuart Paul, great to see you, and thanks for your expertise. Watching and listening in real time with us here on Bloomberg Radio. The Fed Chair just wrapping a couple of moments ago, if you're just joining us. Day one of testimony on Capitol Hill. The Senate side, we check that box and go to the House tomorrow. Nathan Dean is on his way in. His take from Bloomberg Intelligence with his eye on the Fed Chair and the future of Basel III. It's coming up next on the fastest show in politics on Bloomberg.
NASDAQ up 57, also at a record up 0.3%. The NASDAQ 100 index also pushing higher, up now by 0.2%. The Dow, though, trading lower, little change, down less than 0.1%. The Dow now down by 16 points. 10-year yield 4.30%, with a 2-year 4.63%. Spot gold is up 0.1% after yesterday's sell-off, now at $23.60 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.1%, 81.37 for a barrel of WTI. Fed Chair Jay Powell says more good data would strengthen confidence that inflation is moving down toward the central bank's 2% target, and recent readings point to modest further progress on prices. Powell's remarks came before the Senate Banking Committee. They were carried live right here on Bloomberg Radio.
Elevated inflation is not the only risk we face. Reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will continue its practice of carefully assessing incoming data and their implications for the evolving outlook, the balance of risks, and the appropriate path of monetary policy.
Fed Chair Jay Powell, his remarks again carried live on Bloomberg Radio. Boeing delivered 44 commercial aircraft in June. That is the highest monthly total since the company curbed work in its factories in the wake of a harrowing near miss in early January involving a 737 MAX jetliner. We've got Boeing down now by 4%. Rival Airbus, its ADRs down by 3.1%. Recapping stocks mixed. S&P up 13, a gain there of 0.2%. Back we go to Washington, and
13 right now. Not bad. Banks seem to like what they heard. And Nathan Dean is able to check a couple of boxes here on some outstanding issues that we've been talking about for months. Of course, senior U.S. policy analyst here at Bloomberg Intelligence, and with us back at the table. We missed you last week, and good to see you. So he finally came out with it. Basel III, what did we learn?
Yeah, so Jerome Powell actually came out and said today that the Fed's view is that broad and material changes, that they have come to an agreement or are very close to coming to an agreement with the FDIC and the OCC on what that means. Yeah. He wouldn't give us the specifics of that, but he also said that those broad and material changes warrant a reproposal. Now, this has been the big question up in New York with the Wall Street banks. Mm-hmm. Were they going to try and finalize it this year? They had said that they were going to try, but because Jerome Powell came out and said that the reproposal is in the cards, that means finalization is not going to happen in 2024. It most likely will get pushed back to 2025. Implementation of this will probably now begin July 1st, 2026. That's me speculating. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it also means that this is at the whim of the U.S. elections. Right, yeah. And if President Trump wins, new regulatory leadership next year may just say, we're just going to pause on this for now.
So what do investors think? And I'm sure you're hearing from them this morning that we're just going to kind of forget about this for a while?
So there's two ways to think about this. I think the banks themselves very much suspected that a reproposal was in the cards. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that they were actually going to be somewhat surprised, but it's nice to have that clarity from Jerome Powell and that the reproposal is coming. The other way to think about it is that, it takes a long time for capital to build. And so it's not like these banks are going to be able to say that July 21st,
I love this.
Some of those smaller regional banks could actually get some even bigger relief.
Incredible. Well, I mean, the stocks are moving here, right? The banking ETF, KBW, is up 1.5%. JP Morgan's up 2%. They're going to be reporting earnings later this week. That's going to be an interesting conference call now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the question will go from the Basel III endgame because they get more time to breathe here. And then just it moves to general election uncertainty. Just what is it going to happen? Because, there's also a question from Senator Reid, though, of how does the Federal Reserve play in this new world where the Supreme Court has, thrown out the Chevron deference. There's a major questions ruling. Yeah. And Jerome Powell essentially just said, look, it's way too soon, but we follow the law. Now, I think when it comes to the financial regulators, they really don't, for the last 5 or 6 years, Chevron hasn't been an important part of their theory here.
Yeah, right.
But, in this world, the Basel III endgame, as they move through this process, and this is why I think Jerome Powell is insisting on a reproposal here, is that if they don't do it right through this procedure called the Administrative Procedure Act, if they don't get this process right, the courts are going to throw it out for them.
Oh, boy. Fascinating analysis here from Nathan Dean as we try to pick through the tea leaves here, the breadcrumbs, as I said earlier, left by Jay Powell. We heard a lot about Fed independence today, from Republicans, too. Bill Hagerty, who comes on the air and criticizes Joe Biden severely from time to time. In advance of a Trump 2.0, when we're talking about the president having a direct role in setting interest rates. We remember the tweeting at Jay Powell. What do Republicans like Bill Hagerty want to see in another Trump term if there is one?
So I think a lot of the Republicans from Capitol Hill still want to keep a lot of trying to just push the narrative a certain way, but without having a lot of trying to just push the narrative a certain way, but without having that absolute.
It's just up to the
control.
chairman to tune it out in that world.
Exactly.
Jay Powell had some practice with that. Kevin Cramer, senator, was asking about the timing of rate changes, cuts or hikes, suggesting that it would be a bad look, a bad perception, I think the words he used, to move interest rates in September? Are we going to just have to carve out the entire election year at some point?
So, I really defer to our rate strategist, Ira Jersey, on the rate stuff, but I will say is the Fed does not want to be seen playing politics.
They don't, no.
So I can't give you a prediction on when or won't they cut
also
rates.
have to do their job when they need to do it.
Exactly.
Like, where's the balance on that?
But, as you know, everything in Washington is also a political decision. And so despite the fact that the Fed is only about, I think it's 1.5 miles down the road on Constitution Avenue from Capitol Hill and even closer to the White House.
Indeed.
Jerome Powell was always going to keep that in mind because, the Fed does not want to be the one seen as tilting the election one way or another, which is also why we would very unlikely ever see any major rulemaking happen in September or October or November.
So you've got a September and a November here, right? November, I guess, is off the table, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I haven't talked to you in a while. I haven't talked to you about Joe Biden. I don't think I've talked to you since the debate. And I have to pull you into this, if only by way of your relationship with our audience. Not just our viewers and listeners, but terminal users who reach out, as you've heard and seen in these conversations, to Nathan for their thoughts. And I'm always curious what they're asking about. And it sure seemed like, at least over the weekend, it might feel a little different.
Slowly shifting back to President Biden being able to...
Pretty interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
How quickly this can move back and forth.
Exactly. But that's what we tell our clients all the time is, look, we're 4 months out before the election. That could be a year. There's a lot of things that can happen between now and the election. You've got the conventions kicking off next week. You've got a lot of other things that can happen.
Yeah.
And so I think just the narrative until President Biden is nominated either via the convention or via the virtual one in order to get him on the Ohio ballot. Until that happens, that uncertainty is going to always be there.
It's interesting. That's still out there. A Bloomberg story. July 21, I think, is that virtual meeting when they could lock this up for Joe Biden a little bit differently than they would in Chicago. But fascinating. I'm assuming that a VEEP announcement from Donald Trump or the convention itself next week is not a market-moving event.
No, I think what people are going to look for next week is, the President Trump put out the RNC agenda yesterday, right? And it was very much a scaled-down version compared to other agendas. Every Republican agenda for the last 12 years has included Glass-Steagall, the separation of investment and commercial banking. Now, this was actually much more scaled down. Now, I don't think markets are ever paying attention to those agendas, but markets want to be comfortable and get more information on what a Trump 2.0 presidency would look like. And if you begin to see a lot more rhetoric coming out of the convention in terms of China and tariffs, I think markets are going to get a little concerned because it's the macro level impact where the presidency has national security and so forth that I think the markets are focused on initially. It's the policy stuff for companies that comes a little bit later.
We'll see how cutting red tape works against the idea of raising tariffs when they're all in the room next week.
That leadership that President Biden has ushered in the last 3.5 years.
Kirby says today the leaders will...
That leadership that President Biden has ushered in the last 3.5 years.
Kirby says today the leaders will congregate in the auditorium where the NATO treaty was first signed by Harry Truman. Donald Trump will be resurfacing today after laying low for days while the firestorm continues around his rival, President Biden. He'll be holding a rally this evening in front of friendly crowds at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. He's also readying a rollout of his vice presidential choice ahead of next week's Republican National Convention. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Merry Christmas.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average now trading at the best level of the day. A turnaround since our last update, up now by 49 points, a gain of 0.1%. S&P remains higher. S&P trading at a record up 10 right now, up 0.2% to 5582. NASDAQ is up 24 points, up by 0.1%. 10-year yield at 4.30% with a 2-year now yielding 4.63%. Spot gold, little change, lower now by 7 cents the ounce to $23.58. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.1%. WTI at 81.55 a barrel. Bitcoin up 2.2% right now, 57,516 on Bitcoin. Stocks hovering near records as Wall Street views Jeep factories in the wake of that harrowing near miss back in January involving a 737 MAX aircraft. Boeing shares trading lower today. We got Boeing down now by about 0.1%. As for Airbus, also lower, down now by 3.2%. Recapping stocks higher. S&P advancing 10 points, up 0.2%. The Dow, best level of the day, now up by 62 points. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Global News. You'll find our live stream, and we'll meet you in the studio as we keep our eyes today on Capitol Hill. We've been talking about Jay Powell for the most part so far this hour, and the important testimony we brought you earlier from the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But there's some other stuff going on up there, including a closed-door meeting for House Democrats today, something we talked about quite a bit in advance of this happening. They're finally back, everybody. The House and the Senate, Democrats, of course, with a lot to figure out when it comes to Joe Biden. They got together in a room with Hakeem Jeffries, who was said to be in a listen-only mode, and tried to air things out in a family conversation that was described as somber by those in the room. But again, there were no cameras or microphones. This is the circling of the wagons in a very literal sense. Of course, when we left off yesterday, there was one major defection. The highest-ranking Democrat so far in the House to call for Joe Biden to drop out of the race. That would be Adam Smith, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. He talked about his announcement last evening on CNN. Here's what he said.
I think he should step aside.
National spent time in the Biden administration as acting senior director for press, spokesperson at the National Security Council. Adam, welcome to the table. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
Things feel different now than they did 24 hours ago, which felt different than 24 hours before that. We don't see a big exodus like some thought, with dozens of Democrats in the House calling for Joe Biden to step down. Has he turned the corner on this?
There's no question that the president's had a good 24 hours. I think the question everybody's looking for is, can he have another 24 hours like that for the next 119 days? And there's no question he feels he's the best person to be the Democratic nominee. Yeah. If we get the Joe Biden we had the last 24 hours, the message he carried yesterday, it was clear about his record, his vision, then I think Democrats can rally behind that. And I think if that's what he portrays, that's what we'll see.
Lester, he's going to speak again later on about 5 o'clock Eastern time, Washington time. We'll all be listening. I guess for all the wrong reasons, to be honest. It's an important moment here, the 75th anniversary of NATO, and there are going to be some important meetings that take place among world leaders here in Washington. But people are going to be looking at that speech like they do a NASCAR race. What does he have to do to pull it off?
Well, I think he's, to kind of reference, maybe pivot from what Adam was saying, he's got to be perfect pretty much from here on out. We've been none of these malaprops and stumbles and kind of senior moments are new. This has been going on for a long time, and it does appear to be increasing in frequency.
So you saw 0 defections from the Congressional Black Caucus.
Yes, indeed.
You saw members of everybody from AOC, from the very progressive wing, sticking with the president.
Well, I want to ask you about that. That's been an important development. Yeah. It's really why we're talking about a better 24 hours, isn't it? AOC, the squad, behind Joe Biden. These are the same progressives who were arguing with him about the border 5 minutes ago, which is remarkable. The CBC, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, that CBC call with Joe Biden last night was said to be inspirational by the time they were done here. This is going to be the group that saves him?
There's no question those were the voters that helped propel him to win the Democratic nomination.
Yeah.
They helped put him in the White House. He knows they're his base, the bedrock of the Democratic support, the Democratic Party. They've been there to elect Democrats up and down the ticket. I think you also had some swing state folks like Senator Cortez Masto, right, also came out and said Joe Biden's our nominee. And the math is, as Bloomberg would appreciate, he has the delegates. He has the money. And if he decides he wants to be the Democratic nominee, like at the Democratic convention, he'll be the Democratic nominee. Mm-hmm. That's for him to decide, and that's what I think Democrats have to hope and see over the next 119 days, that he prosecutes the case. He's got a great opportunity this week with the NATO summit. Yeah. He's got a press conference, as your Bloomberg colleague said, a big boy press conference, and it's on him to prove to the voters that he's up to the job.
You know, I can't do math, Lester. That's why we have James around here, but I wonder, over the course of this week, if the president clears the hurdle today, has some successful meetings.
Demonstrate that he can do the job he was hired to do, that will be important. But again, the issues we're talking about are not, they're not going to go away. And common sense tells us, and those of us who have parents of a certain age or have seen our grandparents go through this, know what happens. This is not a condition that improves with time. It is something that worsens with time. So I do think we need to be very grounded here about what our expectations are for the president. This is a heavy lift that he's got from here on out, and he has not really demonstrated that he's on top of the job thus far. So he's got a lot of work to do, Joe.
Adam, we've talked about the positives for Joe Biden in the last 24-hour news cycle. There was some tough stuff this morning, though. The Wall Street Journal out with a story about a pattern of events like this, a pattern of problems, how Biden's inner circle worked to keep signs of aging under wraps. They talk about him even missing a meeting with the Chancellor of Germany because he had to get some rest. And I know the White House pushed back on that. But look at the New York Times. Did you see James Carville this morning? Biden won't win, his headline in the op-ed. Democrats need a plan. Here's one. He's taking this on the road. We're going to have a mini primary thing and find all new people. He says, mark my words, Joe Biden is going to be out of the 24 presidential race. Are Democrats their own worst enemies here?
Look, there's nothing that Democrats love more than a panic. And win because the stakes are just that high.
So I don't know. Is there a certain arrogance to that, Lester, or is it admirable? I talked to Jake Auchincloss, the congressman from Massachusetts, who's been a real ally of Joe Biden. I asked him, do you believe Joe Biden's the only person who could beat Donald Trump? And he talked about the breadth of talent in the Democratic Party. Is that really a line that he should pursue?
Well, it's an interesting conundrum for Democrats. They of course have some talent at the level below the president, but have they been tested by a national campaign? Have they withstood the scrutiny of the press and of the opposition party? The kinds of, exposing weaknesses and skeletons in closets and things like that. The answer is not really. So yes, it would be a gamble. I think and by the way, I'm going to disagree with Adam a little bit. I do think there is some leadership in the party that can make a difference. Joe Biden is president largely because Barack Obama selected him to be vice president back in 2008. Where is former President Obama right now? He could show leadership here. He could take action here and do, frankly, what I think is not just in the best interests of the Democratic Party, but also in the best interests of the United States, and do some moves. And maybe they have to be behind the scenes at first. But this is not just up to one man.
There's no pressure there. It has been suggested. And by the way, it's not lost on me, Lester, that little birdie tells me you saw the Rolling Stones last weekend with an 80-year-old Mick Jagger dancing around the stage. I don't know if he made you move or not. But then again, he's not running for president, which is what we're talking about here. Does Barack Obama play the Barry Goldwater in that?
I mean, but the sense I get is that, listen to what John Kirby said at the White House briefing yesterday. He's in it. He's asking details. He's trying to be as detailed and as focused as he possibly can be. And you have to take him at his word in some respects. Like, he says he's running. Like, he's the head of the Democratic Party. And I think this idea that there's some backroom deal that we construct to force him out of the race is just foolish. I just don't think that's the way Joe Biden's going to make a decision. And it's going to be with his family and look, somebody who's wanted to be president for a lot of his life, he's not walking away from that office. Very few people would walk away from being president of the United States. I don't think Joe Biden's
I know what they say. Once you get the jet, you're never going back. Adam Hodge is with us along with Lester Munson, our great panel today on Balance of Power. They'll be back in our second hour as we bring Kaylee Lyons back into the fold, reconnecting with some friends today here in the nation's capital with a lot to talk about on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Washington, D.C.
NATO converges on Washington. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the alliance marks its 75th anniversary later today with a speech from President Joe Biden. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is the latest test, Kaylee, for Joe Biden, as well as an alliance that's been challenged by politics here in the U.S. and now more recently in Europe.
And this meeting here in Washington comes at a critical moment for the president and his re-election campaign, as not only will all eyes be on his speech tonight and his press conference later on this week in terms of American voters and even allies, but also members of Congress, both House Democrats and senators, as they return to Washington, had some family meetings, shall we say, this morning. And it's not clear that there's a clear consensus within the party as to whether or not they believe Joe Biden should be the nominee.
We'll be getting into this with our panel and with a member of Congress, Brad Sherman, a Democrat who was in that meeting. Will join a bit later on, Kaylee. There was no kind of exodus that was predicted yesterday when Adam Smith raised his hand, who's, of course, the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee. We thought maybe we were on the brink of the dam breaking, but it just hasn't felt like that today. And the White House thinks it's been a pretty darn good 24 hours.
Yeah, we'll see about the next 24 to 48 as we see the president in action at the NATO summit. So we have a lot to talk about this hour. First, though, as always, considering Chairman Powell was testifying on the Hill earlier today as well, let's get a check on the markets with Charlie Pellet up in New York.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee Lyons. Welcome back. We are at the best level of the day right now on the Dow Jones. Back in the green right now. They have been swinging between gains and losses. The stock has rallied about 14% in the past 5 sessions. We've got the SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange's Semiconductor Index, trading lower, down by about 0.5%. 1%. Again, recapping here, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all gaining. S&P up 13 now to 5586, up 0.2%, on track for another record close. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. Kaylee and Joe, indeed, coming to you live from Washington, which is a busy town, I must say, this week. A lot of roads leading to the Bloomberg office here, blocked off, closed. I think traffic was a nightmare this morning because there are a lot of important people in town, Joe, including the NATO countries.
True, yes.
There's more than 30 of them, and it's all teeing up a very big moment, or moments, plural, for President Joe Biden.
Yeah, if you want some real elitist complaining here, you can't get around the nation's capital. It's brutal outside. It's also about 100 degrees if we put those two together. That's kind of the backdrop for this summit. And can we welcome Kaylee Lyons back? It's great to see you. We missed you for the last week. Now that we get serious about some stuff here, this is an important moment. Joe Biden's going to speak around 5 o'clock, about 4 hours from now. That will be followed by his news conference on Thursday. The world is watching, not just Washington. And we'll bring you up to date on what's been happening on Capitol Hill earlier today. Let's bring in Nick Wadhams first to talk about what's behind this summit and what we should be looking for. He runs our national security coverage here in Washington. And it's great to see you back here, Nick. This is a big deal, 75 years. It's got a bit of a cloud.
Polarized the far right in a lot of ways. So you have these leaders coming in where they're polarized the far right in a lot of ways. So you have these leaders coming in where their focus really is elsewhere. And then underneath all of that, you have the fact that they can't agree on Ukraine. So again, we get into this dynamic where they're dangling the idea of membership at some point for Ukraine, but not giving a firm timeline on when that might happen. And that's the thing that Ukraine really wants.
And of course, Ukraine is going to make the case in person here. President Vladimir Zelensky is in Washington for the summit. If not an invitation to be a member, can Ukraine expect anything tangible to come from NATO within the next few days?
Well, I think what you will see, what we're hearing is that there will be an announcement around air defense. What they really want is additional air defenses, so maybe some more Patriots, a few more batteries, something like that. And then a potential form of a longer-term commitment. But what we're not really going to see is anything that actually changes the situation on the ground that would allow Ukraine to expel Russian forces from its territory. We're going to see Ukraine basically be in a bunker mode. And so that's really the bigger question on Ukraine that hovers over this whole thing. Okay, you're going to continue flowing weapons to Ukraine, but not give them the weapons they need to expel Russia for good. So then what is the long-term end game here? Do you just keep going indefinitely? Something they have not been able to answer.
Questions about, you mentioned air defenses, the use of F-16s, which we labored over for months, Nick. We talked to you about it. It was a no, then a maybe, then a yes. Now apparently there are some real challenges
to get these jets in operation over Ukraine, and then you'd be talking about a small number. So it's a big investment for not a lot of show.
Well, and if we're talking over the span of years, a lot could change within the course of just the next year, including potentially who the president of the United States is. How much should we expect to hear from NATO members about their plans for the potential of a Trump 2.0? How much will that dominate the conversation this week?
Well, I mean, it's a great question because there is no question that it is one of the biggest things on everybody's mind, essentially, aside from Joe Biden's age. But there is also no question that they really do not want to be talking about it, or they will be talking about it in a way that they don't acknowledge it. So you have Canada coming and saying, okay, we're going to offer our path to the appropriate level of defense spending, 2% of GDP. We're gonna tell you how we're gonna get there. We're not there yet, but we want to get there. That is something that's really aimed at appeasing Republicans, Donald Trump, who say, listen, everybody in NATO needs to be spending that amount. So you're gonna see a lot of Trump-proofing / Trump orientation in anticipation of him coming, but this is not something, I mean, I'd be shocked if you hear any one of the 30 or so NATO leaders who are in town actually say his name publicly. They're just not going to do it.
Isn't that something? We're going to spend a little time later this hour with the foreign minister of Latvia. What does a successful summit look like to her?
Well, the Latvians, like the Baltic countries, they want Ukraine to get far more guarantees. They want a much more robust path for Ukraine to get to NATO, and they also want NATO to make very firm commitments about protecting the eastern flank, because Baltic countries fear that if in the UK have against countries, the big countries, the US, the UK, and the UK have against countries, the big countries, the US, the UK, Germany, not wanting to commit long term. I mean, that's what NATO really wants. Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing Secretary General, he wants long-term commitments from all these countries, basically to move well beyond Trump and offer those guarantees to Ukraine. They do not want to offer that. So I expect you'll see some financial commitments, but certainly not in the tens or 20s of billions of dollars that Ukraine would want.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security coverage. Thank you so much, setting the stage for us.
Great primer.
On this first day of the NATO summit here in Washington. And as we spoke with Nick about, it comes at a time of great domestic question for the United States and President Biden as he gets set to speak at NATO later this afternoon. Just about 4 hours from now is when he is expected as lawmakers on the Hill debate whether he should be the Democratic nominee as they return. We're joined now by one of them, I'm pleased to say, live from Capitol Hill, Congressman Brad Sherman of California. The Democrat is with us. Now, Congressman, we do want to talk to you as you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee about NATO and some other matters as well. But of course, there was a caucus meeting with you and your colleagues this morning. Did any consensus about the future of Biden as the nominee emerge from that meeting, or did it just create more confusion?
We had a consensus that Biden has been an outstanding president. Biden had a bad night. Trump has led a bad life. As to what we should do now, I won't say that, we're a Democratic Party. We've got a lot of different views. Some thought that no matter what, Biden should be our...
For Joe Biden here, while I realize you want to see more, how much time is there for Democrats? Is it between now and the convention in Chicago, or are we looking at a couple of weeks here, knowing that we've got issues potentially getting on ballots and so forth, if it's not going to be Joe Biden at the top of the ticket?
I think it's clear that we can get on all the ballots if we act at the time of our convention. Ohio was an outlier. They've changed their rules. So although we were planning to meet Ohio's requirements by having a virtual vote in early August, we can now do this on August 20th, and that will work for all 50 states. As
so
a
he's
political
got a month.
matter,
The convention is the deadline.
yes, and yet I think we'll be making a decision, a collective decision long before then, and it's I think important that we see before the convention that Biden can meet that test of September 10th when he debates Trump a second time.
What we have heard from the president, Congressman, is a suggestion or a pushback against polling that suggests he is lagging behind Donald Trump in a meaningful way, or perhaps that has widened since his debate performance at the end of last month. Do you believe what you're seeing in the polls?
Well, it takes a while for a major event to really register with the public and really be reflected in the polls. And so I think it's polls for a few days from now that will reflect what happened on June 27th and on June 27th. I think a
ground with colleagues in the House, and from your perch on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman, what are you looking for when Joe Biden speaks at the NATO summit today at 5 o'clock? What do you want to hear? What spirit do you expect him to bring to the podium?
I want him to deal with tough questions that he may not have anticipated and to acquit himself well. I am very sure that his policies toward NATO will be reasonable and ones that I would generally support. So I'm not looking at that press conference in terms of does he have the right views about our foreign policy? I'm looking at that press conference to see whether he can convince the country that that one debate was just an episode.
Okay, so if you're not looking for policy, Congressman, others might be. Is there a tangible outcome you would like to see from the NATO summit this week as it pertains to Ukraine or anything else?
Well, I think we need European countries and Canada to step forward and meet that 2% commitment. The majority of NATO countries have done that, but most of that majority are the smaller countries with the smaller gross national products. We need to see Germany and France step forward. We need to see Canada step forward and spend more on their own defense. They used to think that they're on a totally safe continent. That is clearly not the case.
You make of all this talk of Trump-proofing NATO, Congressman, and the idea of European nations looking to stand up their...
Jerome Powell when he testifies before you tomorrow.
Well, the big issue here was his testimony today that they're going to completely revise and republish the Basel III banking regulations. Too many of our regulations push the banks to put their money on Wall Street and not to make those small loans to businesses on Main Street. And we need bank regulations that don't unfairly discriminate in favor of buying billion-dollar bond portfolios, and instead push the banks to their traditional role of making loans in local cities.
Great to have you back, Congressman. We'll be watching and listening. That hearing starts 10 a.m. tomorrow as Jay Powell moves to the House side. Brad Sherman of California with the view from a Democrat in the middle of this conversation today. Kaylee, pretty interesting. That was a private meeting that we were talking to him about. No cameras or microphones.
Yeah, just a lot of questions for reporters who are out there sweating in the heat as lawmakers emerged. And as the congressman suggested, doesn't seem like they emerged with one idea of whether or not Joe Biden should continue.
I think we got a TBD on that one. Joe Biden speaks next, 5 o'clock. We'll bring you that speech live here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Reported that talks with Elon Musk's xAI about potentially expanding an existing server deal have ended. Now, according to this report, the companies have been discussing a multi-year agreement to rent NVIDIA chips from Oracle for a planned supercomputer in what would have been a $10 billion deal. Again, we've got Oracle trading lower, down now by 3.3%. As for NVIDIA, holding on to its gains, up now by about 1.2%. Stocks are trading mixed. However, NASDAQ is now lower after earlier gains, down 6 right now, a drop of less than 0.1%. Little change there. The S&P up 7, a gain of 0.1%. The Dow up 78, up by about 0.2%. 10-year 4.30%. The 2-year 4.62%. Gold up 50 cents the ounce to $23.59. Little change there. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.4%, 82.03 a barrel. Again, repeating our top story, Elon Musk's xAI and Oracle have ended talks on an AI server deal. This according to the information. Again, Oracle shares are lower. Right now, Oracle down by 3.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the top stories in financial and business news today. Meanwhile, here in Washington, we have a few top stories, and to some extent, they are related, as one pertains to the future of President Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee in this 2024 election cycle. The other pertains to something else on his plate this week, which is the NATO summit that is being held here in Washington. He will be speaking at that
today, as we've been seeing for Joe Biden. But coming off of that conversation we just had with Congressman Sherman, is this good news or bad news when you hear a California Democrat saying, I support Joe Biden, but we haven't found consensus yet?
I think there's no question that the president has had a good 24 hours. And if you look at where the conversation was leading into this weekend, I don't think what you heard from Brad Sherman there was what you would have heard of if we didn't have the last 24 hours from the Biden campaign. The president has been forceful. He's been clear about what his vision and what his record is. He has to maintain that for the next 119 days to prove to the voters why he should be the Democratic nominee. Only he can do that, and that's the task at hand for this week, certainly with NATO, but also leading into the Democratic convention, and then at the debate in September through Election Day.
Well, Lester, considering the concerns about the president's age and mental acuity seem to be so pervasive at this point, how far could one speech this evening at NATO or one press conference later on this week that we're expecting Thursday go to erasing some of those concerns? Or is it going to take more than just a few good moments to erase the bad ones?
I think it's gonna take more than a few, Kaylee. The speech today, I don't think is gonna push things one way or another, absent some dramatic event, because he'll be likely reading off a teleprompter, and he can do okay in that kind of situation. The press conference later this week is a little more interesting. Is he going to get some unexpected questions? You know, the White House the staff have been hit for trying to manage these things a little.
I've said he has had three physicals. In those 3 physicals, that's when he has seen a specialist, a neurological specialist. I cannot speak to every person because there's actually a security reasons to protect their privacy. We respect and protecting people's privacy, so do not want to share. I'm not going to share people's names from here.
Very basic, direct question.
Wait. Hold on. Wait a second.
8 times, or at least once, in regards to the president specifically.
Hold on a second.
That's what you should be able to answer by this point.
Wait, no. No, wait a minute. Ed, please, a little respect here.
That's Ed O'Keefe, our colleague at CBS News, from the briefing room yesterday. So we go to a 2-page letter from the doctor, Kevin O'Connor, who visited the White House. He said Kevin Kennard visited the White House several times over the last year. This is the neurology consultant to the White House medical office, and he apparently holds neurology clinics at the White House for active duty military members. This is difficult for people to start getting through their heads here. Exactly who's coming, who's going? Did he see a neurologist? Does he have Parkinson's? You know, there's something about if you're explaining, you're losing, I think, is the line. Is the White House communications office, the press office, up to this?
Look, I think what you heard from the White House last night is that the president has seen a neurologist. The words were very careful. A neurologist at each physical. Having been in the White House medical unit, having seen people who've come in and gone out of that room, there are a lot of experts. Dr. Kennard, I think his name. That's right. What his full scope of work is there. They then got that clarity and informed the public. That's what you saw last night.
Well, I guess it becomes a question of knowing the intensity of the scrutiny into Joe Biden and his mental and physical health right now. Is it not a moment in which the White House or the campaign needs to be embracing a kind of radical transparency? There's been a lot of talk about taking a cognitive test for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Would it not behoove President Biden, as a candidate who wants to be elected for another 4 years, go deeper into his 80s in the meantime, to just say, all right, fine, I will do it. I will put the questions to bed?
My understanding is that the neurological exam that as part of his physical is more robust than a cognitive test. So I take that as, I'm not a doctor.
Sure.
Neither the three of us are doctors, but I'll take that from what I read and what I heard. I think what is clear that the president should do over the next 119 days is everything they can to dispel this idea that the president is unfit to serve another 4 years. And so, like Congressman Sherman said, it's a good idea. The White House can have him do more press conferences in prime time. Also will help prep for the debate in September. Have a great speech at the convention. Do all those steps to show the American public that what you saw from Joe Biden over the last 24 hours is what you can expect throughout the rest of the campaign and in the next 4 years. That's his job.
Lester, I don't know if you read the New York Times this morning. I don't know if you go near the New York Times, but James Carville's writing an op-ed today, and man, it's a doozy.
This, again, common sense tells us this, the condition of the president is only going in one direction. And he can, you know, as much as the White House staff, God bless them, they're doing their jobs, are trying to offer some spin and some cover and explanations, people see what is happening. They saw it very clearly during the debate. The president really, he's going to have to be flawless going forward here if he's going to stay in this position and be at all competitive with Donald Trump in November. That's the real issue. And I think James Carville, I'm old enough to remember when he was only middle age and a pretty good campaign consultant for Bill Clinton. He really cares about the Democratic Party and about defeating Donald Trump. And that's where this is coming from. And so I think we should, the mechanics may not be perfect for what he's describing, but the sentiment, I think, is spot on.
Adam, you want to quickly weigh in on this? We've got about 30 seconds
Super
left.
Democratic process.
I mean, I think the chances of Barack Obama stepping into an event like that are virtually zero. I think he has shown he has no interest in stepping into that. I think Lester raises a good point about where the Democratic Party is. We've got to figure out, and Joe Biden has to make the case of why he should be the Democratic nominee. If he does that, if he decides he's the nominee, then Democrats have to unite behind him.
All right, Adam Hodge, Democratic strategist and managing director at Bully Pulpit International. Thank you so much for joining us today alongside Republican strategist Lester Munson, who is the co-head of the international practice at the BGR Group. While we've been talking about the Democratic nominee and where the delegates ultimately are going.
And I'm glad that he's ready to continue this fight.
Whitmer says Biden is showing he has the energy to do the job. Well, President Biden will be hosting a high-stakes NATO summit in Washington this week to mark the 75th anniversary of the alliance. A special event is planned for later today. Since Biden became president, NATO has expanded with the addition of Finland and Sweden. Beryl may have left Texas, but the storm's impact will be felt for days. Many of the millions left without power when Beryl crashed into the Houston area as a Category 1 hurricane now face days without air conditioning as dangerous heat threatens the region. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With Bloomberg News Now, I'm Nancy Lyons.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. NASDAQ back in the green. The Dow, the S&P, they are both higher right now. 10-point gain on NASDAQ, up by about 0.1%. Stocks holding pretty much near their peak on a Fed Tuesday with Jay Powell speaking. Yes, you heard his remarks and saw the remarks on Bloomberg television and radio. S&P right now up 8, gain of 0.2%. The Dow up 59, up by 0.1%. We've got the 10-year now yielding 4.30% with the 2-year 4.63%. Spot gold up 0.1%. Little change right now. Gold 23.61 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%, 81.75 a barrel. Oracle shares trading lower right now. We've got Oracle down 2.6%. BP's ADR is trading lower after warning of significantly lower refining margins. It also predicted a write-down on the value of a plant in Germany of $1 to $2 billion. ADRs of BP, they are trading lower today as well. BP right now down by 4.3%. Again, recapping here, S&P up 8, gain there of 0.1%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you as we keep our eyes on the markets, always here on the fastest show in politics, the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Indeed, Kaylee Lyons is back with us today as we usher in the start of an important summit this week in Washington, the 75th anniversary of NATO. And Kaylee, we've been talking about this so much through the guise of Joe Biden's well-being. He's going to be speaking later today. We'll bring you that address, of course, around 5 o'clock, at least some of his words to see how he's feeling and how he's projecting himself. But of course, this is a critical time for the alliance, Kaylee, to be meeting, not only because of Ukraine, but uncertainty throughout Europe following elections over the past week or so here, and a lot of questions about the future of politics here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. These countries' leaders may also be bracing for the potential return of Donald Trump, questioning what that might mean for this alliance that now, of course, is much larger as it celebrates its 75th anniversary with the addition of Sweden and Finland, of course, that we've seen under the Joe. We do expect that Ukraine will feature highly, as well as concerns about what Russia could do next if it indeed is victorious in Ukraine. And that's a concern that especially the Baltic states we know very much have. And we want to bring in now a foreign minister.
You know, for 6 months and then rotating them again to a collective defense, back to collective defense, what we had in the Cold War times with General Eisenhower establishing the basis of that after the Second World War. So defending allies, having troops in place, having capabilities, having command control in place, ability to reinforce and so on and so forth. So that package is the most important outcome. It goes hand in hand with support to Ukraine, obviously, because what Russia is doing in Ukraine is something that is considered a threat to all allies. So supporting Ukraine in its liberation fight is crucially important. They are fighting for freedom. That's what we all are there for. We all want freedom, right? So winning Ukraine is very important for all of us. And then, of course, working with a wider range of partners from Indo-Pacific, for example. They will be here for the summit to address other challenges and threats, such as, challenges from China, constant cyber attacks you would have seen, trying to change the balance of power globally. So that is also important for all of us, because it's not just about Russia's conventional war, it's also about the challenges to all of us, to who we are and how we function as democracies.
There's a conversation, of course, in Europe right now about levels of commitment when it comes to Ukraine, but also NATO more broadly as the alliance. Because of your border, you're on the front lines of protecting democracy as a NATO member. Do you worry about a fissure in European politics, having seen elections recently when it comes to this issue?
Well, NATO has...
Well, it's you, though, among the allies that potentially are most immediately affected if Russia were to decide to move beyond Ukraine. But exactly, Article 5, theoretically, if Latvia or any other Baltic country, any country in the alliance were to be attacked, theoretically that would trigger all of the NATO forces coming together in a defensive way. How should we think about what that attack could actually mean? Knowing we've seen hybrid attacks, cyber attacks, for example, Russia has been conducting in the region,
and China.
China as well, moving buoys in the river that separates Estonia and Russia. How should we be quantifying what an Article 5 triggering event actually might be? Could it be something like that?
So the important part is actually to have that situational awareness, which means to have the intelligence reconnaissance capabilities to understand the threats. That means both on the Russian side, but also globally. It's about terrorists. It's about cyber attacks from wherever they can come. We have called out also Iran on cyber attacks. So it's important to have that situational awareness to be ready, because once you know what is happening, it's easier to respond. And this is where NATO together, we have invested so much. That's why we have that defense growth in terms of defense spending. That's why we have additional defense capabilities. And that means expensive technology, satellites. That means, reconnaissance capabilities. That means drawing all the data together. Working with the private sector, giving back to the private sector contributing to that open source awareness. So it's a pretty complicated algorithm, but altogether as the alliance, it's not about the Baltic states, it's about whole of NATO.
Defined if Donald Trump is reelected?
No, we don't expect that. We worked very well with the Trump administration before, and we work with all the administrations, and I don't recommend to any politician to comment on another country's internal politics. But whoever is elected, we will work with him, her, them, and it's important for America to know that it has friends and allies. I mean, for all the countries, it's important to have those friends and allies, and there's no closer friend or allies at any country in NATO for America. And I think that's why also when President Trump was in power the previous time, it was very clear that there were all types of rumors that he would withdraw America from NATO and so on and so forth. But it never happened, because at the end, we are better off, stronger together. And as I said, currently the defense spending is at the rise as never before. 23 allies are about 2% of GDP on defense, and it will be rising.
Speaking of spending money on defense or other countries' defense, we don't only have questions about what this election means for potentially U.S. membership in NATO, but also the amount of money the U.S. is going to be willing to continue to provide to Ukraine. It was very difficult for Congress to get the aid passed earlier this year across the finish line. If the U.S. could no longer provide that aid to Ukraine, what would that mean for other NATO countries if Ukraine is less in its ability to defend against the Russian invasion as a result?
Let me be straightforward. I think that fighting forces in Europe today, I mean, it's a country, it's a power that has shown with the biggest army in Europe that it's able to defend itself. Yes, with the Allies' help, obviously, and that's will make NATO stronger. It will make America stronger once Ukraine joins
Should there
NATO.
be a timeline?
Possibly. Again, it depends on the success on the battlefield. The sooner Ukraine is victorious and we can reach a deal on the end of the war, as sooner we can sort of finish financing the war. But very clearly also then we can have a sort of post-war architecture with Ukraine in it.
But effectively, the war needs to end first before any of that
Ukraine needs to achieve that victory, that it has to define what is a victory. Nobody else but Ukraine has to define what is a victory on the battlefield. And we have to be there to support them to achieve that.
What do you make of the conversation that we're having here in the United States about our president now, 81 years old, and questions about whether he has the mental acuity to continue, whether his counterparts in NATO think that he should continue in the job? What's your thought? What does Latvia think
Well,
about
I met President Biden both when I worked at NATO, and I look forward to seeing him tomorrow at the summit.
Yeah.
And I wish at age of 81 I would be as strong as he is. We all have our ups and downs, at some moment, so I don't expect it to lead any kind of tragic outcome or anything. But quite clearly, American democracy will be able to handle all the challenges, and you will find the way through this. America and the link with allies is as strong as ever, that we are as united as ever, and the strength and the belief in freedom and democracy, both in Europe, in America, and support Ukraine is there.
Yeah.
All right, Minister, we appreciate you joining us here at Bloomberg today. That's Latvia's Foreign Minister, Baiba Braja, here with us around the table, and enjoy the remainder of your very hot time here in Washington. Make sure to hydrate. We appreciate your time, Minister. Thank you so much. And it's interesting, Joe, to hear from her there that effectively the alliance is looking at the United States of America. And sure, the president is important, given his, as I described, position as the leader of the free world. But ultimately, what it might come down to is whether the U.S. is still going to be there as a leading democracy.
And a system of politics that could be tested yet. The next test for Joe Biden comes at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have our eyes and ears on his address from the NATO summit. And we'll meet you back here at 5 o'clock for the late edition of Balance of Power. It's on to Bloomberg Business Week now, live from New York on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studio here in New York, streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. It is Tuesday, July 9th, 2024. Carol Massar and Tim Stenevec are both off today, but not to worry. I'm here, Jess Mitten, Deputy Team Leader and Senior Reporter at Bloomberg News, and the one and only Bloomberg News' David Gura was with me today for the next 3 hours.
Great to be here, host of the Big Take podcast, and kind of wearing a bunch of different hats here, but
Doing
very glad to be here on a day when we had Fed Chair Jerome Powell testifying before
That's
the
right.
Senate Banking Committee, the first of 2 days of testimony. He kind of reiterating what he said at meetings past. I know that we're going to get into that a little bit later today on what's a very busy day in Washington, the NATO summit taking place there in D.C. All eyes, of course, on President Biden as he makes his way through the formalities of that summit, dealing with international leaders and dogging still these questions about his capacity to serve another term in the White House.
That's right. And even with Fed Chair Jerome Powell on Capitol Hill, he'll be back tomorrow in front of the House. And so we'll get a recap of that from, of course, Mike McKee over at Bloomberg News here, as well as Molly Smith on our economics team to kind of walk us through what else we should expect to potentially hear from him tomorrow. But I know there's another story you're excited about talking about later on why Elon Musk's own brand of cancel culture is thriving at SpaceX.
Yeah, Josh Idelson, who covers labor for us, with a tremendous piece looking at allegations that have been made against SpaceX and its founder, Elon Musk, about it being a difficult workplace full of harassment, an effort by some former employees to sue that company. being stymied not just in that.
500 and NASDAQ 100 both still trading around records. We'll have more coming up, but first let's get a business check with the one and only Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. Welcome on board. By the way, we've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. NASDAQ 100 index, though, just turning negative, down 2 points right now. Little changed on the NASDAQ 100 index. Right to the numbers, S&P up 6, a gain of 0.1%. The Dow higher by 6, little change there. NASDAQ up 12, a gain of just under 0.1%. 10-year 4.29% with a 2-year yielding 4.62%. Gold up 0.1%, 23.62 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.8%, 81.70 right now for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line, stocks hovering near records as Jay Powell's economic remarks to lawmakers did little to alter bets that the Fed will be able to cut rates this year. Briefly, we've got Boeing shares trading lower, down 0.6%. Boeing delivered 44 commercial aircraft in June, the highest monthly total since the company curbed work in its factories in the wake of that harrowing near miss in early February involving a 737 MAX jetliner. Again, Boeing shares, they are lower now by 0.7%. Rival Airbus down 3.1%. Recapping, Dow just turning negative, down 7, little change there. S&P holding on to a gain of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you, Charlie. We appreciate it, Jess Minton. And David Gura here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We were just speaking about how Fed Chair Jerome Powell did say more good inflation data would still need to boost the Fed's confidence. But of course, we will get another update on CPI, David.
Have shown some modest further progress. And more good data would strengthen our confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. We continue to make decisions meeting by meeting. We know that reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could stall or even reverse the progress that we've seen on inflation.
All right, so that was obviously Fed Chair Jerome Powell on Capitol Hill, who will be speaking tomorrow as well in front of the House. So I want to bring in Ira Jersey, who here works at Bloomberg News, he's our U.S. interest rate strategist, and he's based actually at the Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters in New Jersey, as well as Molly Smith, who is one of our top editors here for the economics desk. I'll start with you, Molly, to kind of get a recap here of what people were expecting Fed Chair Powell to say versus what we ended up getting here.
Yeah, two very different things. I think people were obviously hoping to get a bit more about the timing of when we might be seeing some interest rate cuts, and Powell on 2 occasions said he will not be offering any signals on the timing of interest rate cuts, which I said to the chat, I guess we can all go home. Since, it seems like that's really what we were all here for. And he then said again, when another lawmaker had pressed him on the topic, had also said, yeah, I'm not really going to get into that today. So bit of a bummer. So we're all still here sitting, okay, maybe 1, maybe 2.
Right.
TBD.
TBD. Ira Jersey, let me turn to you. That's the editor's perspective. Let me get the market strategy perspective on this as well. What were you listening for, and what did you hear from the Fed chair today?
Well, first, let me say that Lori does a great job with the T-Live chats. So if you're, if you can't listen to radio or watch TV and you have a Bloomberg terminal, definitely hit up T-Live. The next move as a hike was likely. And that's something that, remember, just 2 months ago, we were pricing for almost a 20% probability of a hike. That's almost being completely priced out of the market now.
Well, Molly, I want to bring you back into the conversation because David and I had mentioned we will get another update on CPI on Thursday. What are the expectations here from economists?
Yeah, so probably going to get something that's a bit more of a maybe inflation still gradually coming down. If anything, maybe moving still a little bit sideways in this range that it's been in. We've seen, which, Powell alluded to today, the big moves in inflation are past us, which, is to be expected at this point. There's less progress to be made, and it's going to be coming in, smaller chunks with each report that we get. So there was definitely a lot of questions on housing inflation today, and that there's, the best thing that Powell said that the Fed can do for the housing market is to get inflation back to 2%. So that will hopefully then bring, Treasury yields and interest rates back down, and then make, mortgage rates also more affordable. So that's really, to be expected from him. That they can't really control, of course, that the U.S. has a persistent structural shortage of housing, and that's what when he was saying, well, this is you on lawmakers to try to, that's more your job, and that's not something we can do.
No, we're going to get into that a little bit later in the show. But Molly, let me ask you about the crucible in which this is happening. So this is before the Senate Banking Committee. You had a pretty forceful statement from the chair of that committee, from Sherrod Brown, basically saying to the Fed chair, stop raising rates, bring rates down, that this is having a really deleterious effect on the American consumer, on those who want to buy houses. And there was also this kind of moment of emphasis on the chair's part about the independence of...
And just stressing, the Fed's credibility really relies on its independence.
Hey, Ira, I want to bring you back into the conversation. What are you seeing when we're talking about, say, speculative net positioning when you're looking at the bond market, and what that tells us about where traders are betting where rates could be headed in the second half of this year?
Well, a lot of the spec positioning right now is really basis trade. So it's people trading futures versus cash. There's a little tiny bit of money to be made. So in order to make that money, though, you have to lever yourself a lot. So that's one reason why you have such large shorts in some of the contracts. I want to go back to something that Molly said just a second ago, and that's about what Jay Powell and